Okay.
I think I'll just turn it over to you, and you can talk or share your screen, and when you're ready.
Okay. So I can hear you, and I'm assuming you can hear me, and that everybody out there in the internet can hear me too. So a brief little bit about me, and then I'll jump to some slides, and then leave lots of time for questions and answers, hopefully out there. I'm an Antioch grad, so someday you'll all look like this, I suppose. A long time ago, I work in regional planning in Vermont, and for those of you in other parts of the country, that's close to a county planning office. I cover 30 towns in East Central Vermont. I'm sitting right now in Woodstock, Vermont, if that places me on a map for you. I bring to the planning field a little bit of emergency management background, and that may be helpful as we talk tonight. I was a National Park Service wildlands firefighter many years ago. So I come a little bit with that responder attitude, which I think is very helpful when doing emergency planning, because you're going to be dealing with responders as well. My prime thing that I do is I work with towns on planning and zoning, typically land use bylaws, and a lot of that is floodplain regulation, which is our #1 hazard in Vermont, flooding. So with that, I'm going to jump over to some slides here, I think, and hopefully this will work, and then talk my way through those. And here we go. So again, the topic Michael asked me to talk about was mitigation, planning, and resilience a little bit, and I'm going to frame that in the larger context as well. And really around how do towns understand risk, which is really about how do people understand risk, because towns are people. And where I work in rural America, they're volunteers, so they're not technically trained necessarily in any of this. They're not a city manager. A few towns may have a paid planner, but in general, they're just volunteers who are showing up. And, they're farmers and builders and electricians and you name it. So they understand risk the way they understand any old risk, which is not necessarily rational out there. They use their local knowledge when we're talking about specific risks out there. And of course, they're biased, like all of us are, towards what they have experienced in their own lives. Research shows that you're likely to believe that which you can envision. So if something is believable and relatable, it makes it more likely in your mind, even though that may not actually be the case. If you can see my slides there, you see we're biased towards the things that are easily imagined, like sharks. And I have a slide in a talk I do where I give a shark and a peanut, because peanuts are much more dangerous than sharks, actually, to people, but peanuts don't look very dangerous because we have no instinctual reaction to the image of a peanut. But if you show a picture of a shark with all the teeth and everything out there, we have an instinctual reaction to that. So we rate their risk higher because they make an immediate response, even though your risk of a shark attack is very low. Obviously, right now, your risk of getting the measles is much higher than having a shark attack, for example, in the United States. We also bias away. In general, humans don't like to think about unpleasant things, except emergency people, which is why if you're having a risk discussion, emergency people are handy to have in the room, because they tend to think about unpleasant things all the time. And they also tend to be pretty funny while you're at it. But they have a pretty good grasp of the things that they have seen and what they think of as an emergency. We're not good with low probability events. They don't happen much. We kind of wipe them off of our mind. And we're not very good with future incidents, probably because we're all going to die and we don't want to think about that every day and night. But we're not good with things like climate change, with things that go forward and not necessarily look like the things behind us. So how do we do this thing in the emergency world and then in the mitigation and planning world? In the emergency world, we do something we call a THIRA, which is a threats and hazards inventory and risk assessment. Well, you know, in security, a lot we're looking at the terrorism or train derailment or something out there. In the natural hazard world, we're looking at the things that nature will give you. Some of those have advance warning, some of them don't. Your state emergency office, wherever you are, I'm sure has done a THIRA. I'm sure your state also has a state hazard mitigation plan, which has looked primarily at natural hazards because that's what the statute around mitigation planning says, to look at natural hazards.
Kevin, what's a THIRA?
Oh, so THIRA is that threats and hazards and inventory risk assessment. It's a full-blown, both natural and man-made hazard listing out there, and then trying to figure out how vulnerable you are to those things. In Vermont, it happens that floods are number one amongst man-made or natural hazard out there. Number two sometimes is probably a hazardous materials incident, a train, you know, or truck rolling over, that type of thing. Terrorism is actually relatively low risk. It's actually relatively low risk wherever you are, compared to, you know, all sorts of things that'll happen to you. But essentially what either a THIRA or the risk assessment done in a mitigation plan do is they ask three questions. Three, not two, three. Well, what can happen? How bad will it be? And how vulnerable are you to that happening? And so, oops, let me see, did I get that? Yes, all right. In a local hazard mitigation plan, which is something you're not required to do, but something towns should do, and they're typically done at the town level, sometimes done at the county level. A state has a mitigation plan too, which you can go and steal stuff from if you want to. But they go to FEMA, and FEMA approves them. And with that mitigation plan in hand, you can get some bonus things, and you can get some certain grants and stuff. But what they're really meant for is, like any plan, is for your own internal use, and it's to think about what can happen and what you're going to do about that. The way we write them is we use that data from the National Weather Service, which often will list all the reported weather-related hazards out there. We look at past FEMA disaster declarations, and you can kind of mine those and get damage information out of there. There's something called HAZs, which is a FEMA software product, which you can kind of run scenarios through, and that's what we use for earthquakes, for example, to give us a anticipated earthquake damage thing. They're written by local contractors, including people like me. And just going to close that thing. I don't know if you can see it.
So let me just ask you, so you're using historical data.
Yeah.
So if you're using historical data, I don't want to get too far into the sort of the variability and frequency, but it's sort of like, what data are you, I mean, it's sort of how far back are you really considering, and does it really apply to the future?
Well, as you know, Michael, it probably applies less and less to the future if we're looking at climate. Probably if we're looking at earthquakes, I suppose past risk and future risk are somewhat the same. If you're looking at flooding, which we are in the Northeast, the data indicate that about 1996 things changed drastically, and not so much that we're on a curve, but we went up to a new plateau, and we have a much higher incidence of extreme rainfall events. What we don't know is, will that go up again and we get to a new plateau somehow? There are things out there that are now, you know, we're looking at heat, for example. We never used to look at heat in terms of the future. We're looking at Lyme disease, tick-borne illnesses. And there's other anaplasmosis, Powassan virus, you name it, in the tick-borne area that we never used to deal with. So there are certainly things changing going forward, but we also don't have a great risk idea of the past. You know, we kind of think about the last 100 years maybe as having good data, which is a pretty small data set to be working with. So frankly, in terms of extreme snowstorms, we don't know what a good 500-year snowstorm is. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
Okay, cool. So those local hazard mitigation plans, again, from FEMA's point of view, they want us to evaluate all natural hazards. So tornadoes, volcanoes, everything out there under the sun that can happen to you. And then we kind of throw them off the plate. We say, well, we don't have any coastal erosion because we don't have any coast in Vermont. We don't have any known volcanoes, so that's not a risk. We have some earthquakes, that's a risk. But what we do is we focus on the things that are hotter and bigger and badder. And we use what you see there in front of you, which is the likelihood, the probability, times the severity, times the vulnerability to give you risk. So that likelihood, the things we use most around flooding are the percent chance, the percent annual chance. So what is commonly called the 100-year flood is actually the 1% annual chance flood. So each year you got 1%, 1 out of 100 chance when you roll the dice, that's what you're going to get. That's assuming, of course, that that data is good. And there's a lot of stuff to say that your 100-year flood or your 1% chance flood is probably rapidly becoming your 2% and then your 3% and then your 4% and maybe your 10% chance flood going forward. Irene in Vermont was a 100-year event, a 1,000-year event. If you talk to the Weather Service, they say that's more like a 20-year event maybe in the future out there. So there's likelihood, probability. There's severity. What's it going to do to you? Is it going to knock out all your bridges, a couple bridges, kill 10 people, kill 100 people, turn off the power for a month? Whatever that is. And then your vulnerability to it, which is a newer part of FEMA's analysis, really within the last 5 years or so. So, for example, a heat wave, or if you have a bunch of elderly in high-rise apartments who don't have a lot of money and therefore they may not have air conditioning, they're much, much more vulnerable to a heat wave incident than if you have an affluent society and they all, can go to the club or to the pool and they all have air conditioners. So you have a hazard doesn't necessarily mean a problem. A hazard that happens, and then how vulnerable are you to that hazard? And that's important to look at when you do these things. With towns, what they perceive as a risk is somewhat driven by the things that they're willing to do stuff about as well. So if they live in a flood zone and you point out you're in a flood zone, they may kind of push back about that because they don't really think of themselves that way. They don't think of themselves as kind of being in the wrong place. And a lot of them are from a risk perspective. They also don't want to change necessarily. And so the thing that creates the hazard may be something that they don't, this part of their identity. And then they also look at costs. A lot of that is, if you say, okay, your bridges are too small or that type of thing, and then you start looking at fixing bridges, they may just balk at, oh, here's, we can't fix all the bridges. Therefore, we don't think we can address the problem. Therefore, we don't want you to call it a problem. And of course, that's working backwards. But sometimes you just have to deal with that. And I think, here we are. I think this is my last slide, and then hopefully we'll chit-chat a bunch. This has to do with those local hazard mitigation plans, which are a FEMA thing, and they go to the state, and then they go to FEMA to get approved, and all the other plans that towns do, and that we work on and you may work on, which is a local emergency plan. A lot of towns have them. A local comprehensive plan that drives land use and other things out there. Your responders have a plan. They've got a fire incident plan or a train derailment plan. They may have a flood plan. but those what we call operational response plans. The infrastructure design, which may not have a plan, but they may have a standard that they use. In Vermont, we have what we call road and bridge standards, which basically say if you're going to build a road or bridge, these are how you size that facility out there, which is very, very important because you can do all the stuff over here, but if they're building bridges that are too small over there because that's what their book tells them to do, then you got fighting issues. Land use planning, again, is what I do, and the codes and regulations around that, the site standards. To me, all of those things should be integrated, and they're typically done, especially in a bigger town, by different people who may not be talking to each other at all. So if you get into this, one of the big things I would say is to get those people talking to each other. And especially kind of get the planning people who sit at desks talking more with the emergency people who are out running around with lights and sirens, because they are fascinating and they actually have import to each other's work. So I think that's it for me. So now I'm going to go back to just my head.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about how how it occurs? How does the plan occur? Who's involved? Is it you because you're an expert at the regional level, or is it a citizen driven process? And if it's a citizen driven process, who facilitates that? If you have or don't have a regional planner.
Great. So the theoretical way it should happen is, like any plan, it should be based upon a lot of community input. However, and that's where you get buy-in. However, the community doesn't necessarily have a good technical understanding of their risk. So they may think, like a lot of people think, oh, terrorism is the problem. Well, frankly, it's not very big of a problem anywhere. But they may think, oh, our bigger problem is a certain natural hazard, and really the technical data says no. So there's going to be some education in there by technical experts. And you may be able, even if you're the technical expert and you're in the town, it may be handier to go get an outside technical expert to come in from the state emergency office or somewhere. So we try to bring data to that process, but there is always a local committee or an advisory board or somebody at the local level that's going through that process locally, because it's going to be their plan when you get done. I mean, I go home, they got to remember they have a plan. And the FEMA is really kind of drives that home. FEMA really wants to see process. So they want to see minutes of meetings. They want to see who showed up. And typically what we try to do is we try to get the select board, which in Vermont is what we call the local legislative body in towns. So maybe your city council or alderman, or has other names in parts of the country. They have the decision makers, the people who assign checks there. Then you have a planning body. Typically we gather the planning commission, but there may be a prudential committee, an emergency board, some people who think about things and write stuff down. And so you get some of them. And then we try to get their actual responders, which in most of our towns ends up being just the fire chief, the volunteer fire chief in Vermont. Again, in big cities, you'll have a department and get somebody around that. Since it's natural hazards versus, people with bombs and whatnot, fire departments are the best folks. They're the folks who do deal with a building that falls down from an earthquake. They're the folks who probably man the swiftwater rescue team in terms of floods. They're, pulling people out of high places and low places and stuck places. And what they do is they give a lot of cred to things that go on. And I use this in rural areas especially, because if you can get the fire chief in a small New England town to support an effort, you have just kind of won the social lottery, because they carry a lot of weight. Whereas potentially the person on the planning commission doesn't carry that social weight. So again, your local leaders, your emergency responders, and the people who do planning, whether it's the town planner, a planning commission, whoever is dealing with that.
Okay, great. Julie, why don't you unmute, and you have a couple of questions, so why don't you ask? Julie, can you hear me?
Julie, I see a thing that says I'm not set up to chat.
Okay, well, so I have two questions from Julie.
Okay.
Did you notice that change in 1996? You know, you said the flooding increased dramatically, or did you learn about it through scientific research?
I learned about that particular thing from a guy named Eric Osterberg, who does this type of work on Dartmouth, and they've just crunched a bunch of numbers because there was some indication that extreme events were increasing, especially in the Northeast, and they actually crunched the numbers and they said, well, yeah, they're increasing more than we thought. And by extreme events, they're really looking at 4-inch rainstorms and things like that. Personally, I would say in our neck of the woods, 98 and on has really been, we pretty much have a presidential disaster every year since 98 and on. So, you know, the kind of anecdotal personal evidence is it floods a lot now. It typically used to be spring flooding when snowmelt happened, and now it's much, much more summertime, fall related storms.
Okay. And our follow-up question, does Vermont ever do hazard mitigation plans at either the county, and this is more important, the watershed level scale, especially when you're talking about water?
Yeah, the answer is generally no. It's certainly not at the watershed level. Some regions do it. We call those multi-jurisdiction plans. We used to do that, and then we went to the town level for a variety of reasons. One is that FEMA requires that a multi-jurisdiction plan be adopted by the jurisdiction. And so we wrote a big one for our region. We have 30 towns, and then we went around and got them all to adopt it. But they're only good for 5 years, and FEMA starts counting those 5 years when the first town adopts it. So if you get a laggard town, by the time they adopt it, they've only got like 2 years left on the plan. So we decided to get away from that, and now we just do it one at a time. We've talked about doing it on a watershed basis. Our boundaries are not that great watershed-wise. You would need an entity that works at a watershed basis, but again, that entity has no standing usually in FEMA's eyes as an authority, and so you're going to be back to the town level and getting each one of them to adopt it. Unless you're in a place that has like strong county government, and they could actually just do a county. They're a real legal entity. Probably could adopt it that way.
Okay. I have another question is, why do the plan? What's the advantage to a town of doing the plan besides the obvious, well, at least they looked at it. I mean, it's sort of, you keep mentioning FEMA, so what does this mean to FEMA?
So the biggest carrot I would say that FEMA has is every time you have a disaster, then you get bonus money. It's kind of bonus money for having the disaster, called hazard mitigation money, known in the trade as 406 money. But every time you have a disaster, whatever that total cost of the disaster is, FEMA gives you 15% of that on top of the disaster to do with what you want, as long as it's mitigation related. So let's say we have a $2 million flood, the state gets $300,000 out of that. And then they can go around and do mitigation stuff. But that money can only go to towns with approved mitigation plans. So that's probably the best carrot out there. In Vermont, our state kind of doubled on top of that, and we actually offer additional state match after disaster. You get a disaster in general, federal disaster, FEMA is going to pay 75%, and the 25% is on somebody else. In Vermont, the state picks up 12.5%, the town gets 12.5%. Unless you've done several things, one of them being get a mitigation plan, in which case the state will pick up a little more and you can pick up a little less. And in a disaster, you know, if you're talking, I mean, my little town of Pomfret, which is over the hill over there, had several $1 million of road damage in Irene, and so a percent goes a long ways.
Okay.
Hi, Kevin. Can you hear me?
I can hear somebody.
Oh, hi. My name's Vincent. I'm in New York. I had a question about kind of the process of doing a risk analysis. So I work for a consulting firm, and we often will do climate change vulnerability assessments with communities, typically larger cities, but sometimes smaller cities or towns. And we obviously on the probability side, there's kind of a standard understanding of what to use for the inputs. And the same goes for, I guess, understanding the impact. But on the vulnerability side, I'm wondering, is there kind of like a standard process or set of things to look at to quantitatively analyze vulnerability?
Great, very good question. There is, to my knowledge, at least in Vermont, there is not a kind of metric around vulnerability. I've seen some other places where they have tried to develop a metric, and you kind of could make up your own as long as you use it consistently. Really, what it typically focuses around is social vulnerability. So it's typically, and you try to use data that you have handy. So you may look at poverty levels, you may look at people over 65. From the census, you can gather people who are mobility impaired. So that would feed into things like evacuation planning. Well, we know we don't have a lot of people who can actually evacuate themselves, so that we have a higher risk. Things like that. So that's typically where I see it. You might look at tax burden. You might look at the ability of a place to withstand financially a disaster. And obviously, the more cash they have, the more they can bounce back fast. But it's typically going to be in those two areas.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Vin. Dave Pomerantz is asking, with 30 towns in your region, is there a regional approach during an emergency flooding itself? I mean, during the event, resources, shelters, equipment. That's one of his questions, and I'll ask the other one.
Okay. So Vermont doesn't have county government, so we don't really have a county emergency office or anything. And what really happens is, in any sizable event, it quickly goes from a town event to a state event. And then the state is kind of managing things and helping out as best as they can. And I sit over there too. I get called up to the state, and so I kind of become a state asset sometimes in these things. And during Irene, for example, I was the state logistics chief for a week of night shifts, buying tarps and sending things, National Guard to places. But in terms of response, it quickly becomes a state level response. And the state are the folks doing the warnings and whatnot. So we would have a conference call to everybody in the state who's going to be affected a day or two in advance. And then we have a daily conference call. During Irene, we had a conference call every day going forward. Our shop, because our towns are so small, there's kind of no there, as we say. We shifted into emergency mode, I think a little bit because I'm a former responder and that's what I do. But also because if you're in this line of work and you want to do emergency planning and then an emergency happens, you don't kind of just sit home and say, well, we wrote you a plan, go read your plan. We get right into the mix. And what we did is we ceased all operations, went to a 24-hour a day work schedule, and then a 12-hour a day work schedule, nonstop for a few weeks. And then we were getting back to normal a little bit. But we carry pagers, and, their cell phones, and I have all sorts of stuff in my car, and we pretty much jump into it.
Okay, the second half of that question from Dave is, are the towns in the region looking at capital planning for infrastructure modifications to ameliorate or mitigate the flood issues?
The answer, well, the answer is kind of twofold, I would say. On one hand, they all do a seat of the pants rough capital planning, which is pretty much based on what they did last year. That gets you through things as long as nothing weird is happening, but something weird is happening right now. And so what you used to do for culverts and bridges, you need to be doing more. In Vermont, we have these road and bridge standards, which say what they need to be. Those are typically much bigger. For example, the state just replaced a culvert on US 5 in Hartford, which was a 3x6 culvert, stone culvert. It broke. That went to an 11-foot culvert. And so that is a big project. And typically, if you've got like maybe an 8-foot culvert, that's going to a 20-foot bridge. So all of a sudden, you're going from an 8-foot culvert might be $100,000 fix, and a 20-foot bridge might be a $500,000 fix. And so towns aren't budgeting like that. They're hoping FEMA or somebody comes along to help them out, but they're not in general proactively getting ahead of those things, except for the small culverts. So if it's a 1-footer, they're putting in 2-footers or 18 inches or something. Those they can pretty much do because that's not a big jump. Most of your cost is labor on those. Besides that, not really.
Okay. This is a two-part question. Let me just go back up to the original. But Jennifer has shared that Massachusetts has a new municipal vulnerability preparedness grant program, which provides funds for towns to hire a consultant to facilitate the planning process.
Mm-hmm.
There is a requirement for stakeholder participation, including broad public outreach.
Yep.
And there is a website for this. And then Anton Lima, he was actually part of a mass vulnerability preparedness program that Jennifer mentioned. And he says, one problem I noticed was getting consensus around the most pressing issues. How do you get towns and diverse stakeholders to agree on the ranking of priorities?
That's kind of the trick. It's going to be, the people who are next to the stream are probably going to say, well, you need to work on the stream over here. And the people who are next to the town forest may say, well, you need to do wildfire over here. And so to me, there's a couple things. There's the technical, actually, what is the risk aspect? So that the more you can kind of make that a rational, reality-based discussion, the better. And then you got to meet people where they are, but it's up to the local leaders eventually to sort that thing out, and try to make it equitable. And that's another thing is, maybe your particular issue is, well, maybe it's flooding, but the flood area has, they've all got money or whatever. And so the issue really becomes maybe a landslide issue over here and the folks who don't have money. And so you may want to stress that a lot more because that's the folks that need resources out there. But like any of these things are a local political process, you're going to take them through that give and take. And it really helps whoever is kind of running that show to have facilitation skills, because a lot of people confuse input with agreement. You need to be able to make sure people feel they're heard. That doesn't mean everybody's going to agree with them. And that's a kind of a special skill to have. Local leaders may be adept at that, or they may not be, and your consultant darn well better be.
So that's great, because it leads right into a question by Morgan. Is what strategies, facilitation tools have you used and liked to bring stakeholders into the conversation on local mitigation measures?
Well, I tell you, we have the darndest time getting people to show up. We're talking towns of 1,000, 2,000 people in general. When we're writing plans, when we're writing zoning, we might get 10 people to a meeting. That's success by far. So try to go and meet the people where they are and let them know about what you're doing. In rural towns especially, it's about you. So they have to meet me if I'm doing it, and they have to think, oh, he's not, a crazy Yahoo. So there's going to be a lot of like, who are you? Where are you from? Where did you grow up? That type of thing. That's important. You can't just jump past that. Like I'm doing a plan, I'm going to go to the dump, which is a transfer station actually, and stand there at the transfer station and talk to people. I just did election day in another town, and that was great. I sat in the hall, so everybody had to go by me with a big poster. And then I actually put a little sign up on the wall that says, "Who's this guy?" pointing to my head to kind of break the ice, because people would look at me, they'd look at the sign, they'd smile a little bit, and then you could talk to them. If you have maps are a great public input way to deal with people, because a lot of hazards are spatially relatable. And if you're standing there with a document, people don't get into it. Everybody loves to look at a map. Everybody likes to find their house on a map, and that really can help the process.
Okay, Shamika, you have a question?
Hi, I am Shamika. I really wanted to thank you for speaking. This is totally in my wheelhouse. I'm a community protection specialist with the Nature Conservancy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I specifically work on coastal resilience plans and helping communities plan and implement those. So everything you're saying, I totally agree with. I particularly wanted to ask a question and then make a comment. And then to Morgan, I also do community organizing. So if you want to reach out to me, I can talk a little bit more about some of the things that Kevin was talking about. So my question would be, can you talk a little bit about some of the issues with FEMA and federal funding based on the outdated maps? So as we're seeing more flooding and sea level rising, there are people who are in areas that are consistently being more flooded that are not under these maps, and they're impacted more and more, and they do not get any funding. And then if you could also mention, because you didn't talk about them before, for folks who don't know, the Army Corps of Engineers and their role in some of the projects that are being done, whether they actually will work or not. I live and work in New York, and there was just a recent project proposed for Manhattan that was tabled, at least for the time being. So, yeah. And I would love to connect with you offline, because I have a whole bunch of notes and questions for you otherwise.
Okay, and Michael, I'm sure will give you my contact data and stuff, and you can find me on the web. So around FEMA maps, and I'll try to be brief around that issue. But for the uninitiated out there, FEMA makes the flood maps. Those are the official flood maps, and as we like to say, they may be wrong, but they're officially wrong. You kind of can't make up your own flood map. You can have technical people make a map to FEMA standards if you don't like their map, and take it through their process. But in general, their map is the map. It's a backwards looking map, not a forwards looking map. So it doesn't take into account sea level rise. It should, but it doesn't. It takes into account things that have happened in the past. What we in Vermont do is we have something we call river corridors, used to call fluvial erosion. because our main issue is that the river moves sideways, not so much that the water comes up. For your coastal zones, I know a lot of states are looking at taking that and at least taking the map and at least adding freeboard, or what they call freeboard. So if FEMA's thing says you have to build to this high, they're saying, Maine's talking about 3 foot, adding 3 foot to all the FEMA projections. If you talk to Rhode Island and other places there, they're looking at maybe 6 feet. Boston's certainly trying to figure out what they're going to be dealing with down there. So you can kind of add that up. Unfortunately, the spatial extent sideways you could add on to, but the FEMA maps kind of go blank. And so if you have detailed topography, I don't know if you have LiDAR where you are, but in Vermont now we have statewide LiDAR, so we have very good spatial topography. And so we could make our own map of what is a certain elevation if we wanted to. From a recovery point of view, I was involved with a lot of buyouts. It's difficult to buy out somebody from FEMA's point of view if they're not in a mapped flood zone. Because again, they look at their map and they go, that was weird, that shouldn't happen, won't ever happen again. Whereas we're like, well, your map's just wrong. And so it makes it much easier to help the people if they are in a mapped area. That's the long and short kind of on maps out there. You had a second part there about, what was it about, remind me.
It looks like she's
Army Corps of Engineers and their role in some of the projects that are proposed and how those are funded in various communities.
Okay, we have very limited experience with Army Corps in our region, except we have 2 existing flood control dams. What Army Corps did do, and FEMA didn't do, is right after Irene, Army Corps did come through and did a high water mark analysis. So they have given us some data, and the towns in their local regulation, you got to use FEMA maps, but you can use other things as well. So you may have pictures, you may have your own homegrown thing, you may have something that the Army Corps did, you can add those on top of the FEMA maps. You kind of can't take away the FEMA maps, but you can do your own stuff on top and say, we also call these out as hazard areas. Especially if you're enabled. In Vermont, you're enabled to do local analysis like that. But we don't have big Army Corps projects, people trying to build levees, that type of stuff, because we don't allow it.
okay. Great, thanks. Maddie, you have a question? You there, Natty?
Yes, I'm here. Start video. Hi, Kevin.
Hi,
thanks for joining us. Towns in Vermont have the option of having a downtown designation to kind of promote business vitality, not necessarily in the event of a disaster, but sort of to build up their downtown and keep people in these small towns. So what are the trends that you're seeing in how either nationally, regionally, or just in Vermont, there's an acknowledgement of the importance of business continuity in community vitality and resilience as it pertains to disasters?
Oh, okay. We've actually done some business continuity work as well for EDA several years ago. I think typically what towns do is they go, businesses are over there, they're doing their thing, and towns go, and businesses go, towns over there doing their thing. And we try to tell them that they should connect with each other, because the business continuity plan assumes that there's roads and there's power and there's water and all these things that the town is doing typically. And so when they're writing their little plan and they say, well, the town will do this, they better go check with the town. Same thing with the towns. They assume that the businesses are, pumping gas and making sandwiches and all the other types of things that you need to happen. And so they better go at least talk to their, we call it the critical services. And so, for example, for us, if you're in the town of Stratford, Vermont, which Michael knows, it's just west of him, Coburn's General Store is the business in town. It's also the gas station. It's also the store. It's all, so that place, and we did a business continuity plan for them, that place has to run to make the town run. If that place doesn't run and you are stuck in town because the road's washed out, you're not eating or getting gas or doing a whole bunch of other things. So I would say talk to the townspeople and say, what things really don't you want to fail here? Because they're going to put everybody out of work, because they perform a crucial service. Maybe they really can save your hinder. We had in Irene, we had a local fuel delivery company, and over in Pittsfield, that valley got stranded, but they had fuel, and so they were a critical facility to be giving folks fuel for generators. So work with those folks, because they may have an asset, they may have a truck, a crane, or whatever that you really want to have locally that you don't have in your own, stable.
So there's a question that sort of has to do with cash flow and cash availability during an event, and if people haven't really planned on the money side of things, where people are. I also will add to that. It's just I know there are some towns that needed contractors or needed backhoes or something or front end loaders, and everyone needed the front end loader, and so they would only go to where the cash was. They were paid on the spot, and so have you looked at the sort of the resilience of the ability to fund an emergency?
We haven't looked at that. I mean, I know some about it. So there's the personal scale. Obviously, if you have no cash on hand, that doesn't help your personal things. And typically, what you can think of is disasters exaggerate current conditions. So if you have a problem with, racial tensions in your community, they get worse during a disaster. You got problems with finance, they get worse. You just go into the disaster with what you had on a sunny day. Most of our towns were able to work with local banks, because we still have local banks, and get immediate lines of credit because they're government. And the bank said, yeah, you're good for it. And we're able to get pretty, millions of dollars available for a town that typically spends $400,000 a year. The problems with that are FEMA does not pay your interest. And so you're going to be out some money, and FEMA is not fast. And that's probably the biggest problem with all of disaster recovery is FEMA. We are still processing bills in Vermont from 7 years ago in places. There are ways to make that faster at the town level, being really organized, but it is not fast.
Okay. Vinny, you want to unmute and just share what you shared in the chat? People may not have read it.
Yeah, I was just offering some thoughts around community engagement through some of our previous work. I think one of the things that we found is having an early conversation with people and kind of asking them to share their assets of what they value in their town is a good way to help people start to build consensus around how they want to approach protection. Obviously, that's it's a qualitative element that is brought into the risk assessment, and it's not necessarily the only thing, but it does help people think about their town in a way, thinking about the risks that are associated with living in their town. The other thing I was saying is that a lot of people tend to, and this is certainly the case for me too, is just thinking about the property or the place that they live, their community, within the context of their lifetime. So there's a lot of history and certainly natural history that people might not know, and has a lot of impact on what happens in their community. when we did a planning process with the community on Long Island, a lot of the people there didn't know that prior to 1930 there was no development, and they were all wetlands, and they all got filled in, and residential communities, suburbs were put there. And when we showed them an overlay of where the wetlands existed and where the flooding happened, the lines were pretty close to a match, and it gave people just a different perspective and kind of made them a little more open to thinking about kind of more innovative and maybe the types of solutions they wouldn't have considered in the past. So just some thoughts I had.
Yeah, that's very good, Vincent. So your historical societies, which are a bunch of people who love history, and they're doing their thing, they may be able to bring in some of the things that have never happened in your town and show that they actually have happened. And those are great for coastal areas or for areas built on fill. You can show, why is it flooding here? Well, because it's the river. The river was there. I can show you a picture of the river being there. I can have a guy who used to fish where your house is. That's why the water wants to be there.
Okay. Hillary, you want to unmute and ask a question?
Sure. Hey, Kevin, I was just wondering, I think the Two Rivers Ottaquechee work with High Meadows Fund on some kind of a watershed scale
Yes.
risk hazard planning. And I know we did too, and I'm still working on that locally, but I guess I'm not sure how successful I've been. The town I've been working with just flooded again a couple days ago during this melt. So I wondered how you felt about the future of that watershed scale risk planning for flood resilience and climate change.
I think it's difficult, although not impossible. Pretty much with our level of development in Vermont, we're not shunting the water. We're not building some big levee and the next town over is going to get squashed. We are potentially allowing development that would either help or hinder anybody downstream. And I think we're doing a decent job about that. And one of the little checks in Vermont is that if you want a regionally approved town plan, you have to speak about how that plan relates to adjacent plans. And so if we saw somebody, for example, in Woodstock, upstream, there's a giant wetland in Bridgewater, Killington. And should they decide, which they could do, to fill that in, at least under FEMA's rules, FEMA lets you fill in floodplain. In fact, FEMA kind of assumes you're going to fill in floodplain. We would be on that and going, wait a minute, that's important down here. But in general, I would say there's not a lot of that kind of thinking around the watershed like there should be.
Okay. Eric, you have a question? Want to unmute?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
So my question is in regards to some of the issues that different towns of Vermont had with securing funding from FEMA after Hurricane Irene.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak to what ways can towns be more proactive in securing FEMA funding post-disaster? So that could be in reference to project documentation or infrastructure coding or training of contractors and municipality staff.
Excellent question. So I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit on FEMA here. So bear with me, but if any of you are in a town, helping a town, this should be helpful. First off, you have to understand the time flow. What happens typically is you have a disaster, and then you pile up the information to tell the state, and the state tells the government, who tells the president, and the president says, yep, you have a disaster. Here you go. And that takes a couple weeks. And then it takes a couple weeks for FEMA to get in gear and get out to your town. And so somewhere typically around 3-4 weeks after the disaster, FEMA shows up and does what we call the applicant's briefing. The applicant being the towns. And they say, okay, here are the rules of how you have to spend money from hour one. And they're telling you 30 days out, which makes it difficult because you've just been spending your money. And in fact, by day 30, you're kind of done. You're just looking for a check. So you have to understand that the FEMA is going to give you the rules late. And so what you can do is you can ask FEMA just every now and then to give you an applicant's briefing. And so you get those things ahead of time, which reminds you, oh yeah, we're supposed to do that thing over there. So that's a process thing. The other thing is to hire outside people. If you know it's a federal disaster, you know this is a big one, don't try to do it by yourself. The towns that we saw really go underwater, the town manager hadn't slept in 3 days and wasn't making good decisions. You go procure an engineering firm, hire an instant secretary from Kelly Services or something, just to walk around and write stuff down. Everything is on a 75% sale, is a way to think about it. Get those people, get that gear, so that when FEMA comes to town, you're organized. The better you can hand it to them in a package, and especially take pictures. In Vermont, we're not great about that because we've got a road department, which consists of 2 guys, and they're out filling the holes as fast as they can, and they're not taking a picture. For example, we had maybe a federal declaration with a severe snowstorm this year. Broke a lot of trees off, knocked them into the road. The towns literally pushed them out of the road with a snowplow, kept going. Well, now they're stuck in the bank. Towns in the spring got to go get those things back out of the bank. They didn't take a picture from their plow truck in the night in the snowstorm when there might be a wire hanging out there, but that's what FEMA would like. So the more you can get the photography club, somebody to jump around and take geospatially logged pictures, the better, because that is, if nothing else, that is good. And then the more you can get finance people who are like, I say German, I'm German-Irish, so everything's kind of German or Irish. Get the Germans involved. The people who are really, really meticulous about note-taking and documenting, because it doesn't matter to FEMA that you bought 1 million yards of gravel. It matters where each of those yards went. And you got to document that from the get-go.
Okay. So Julie has a couple questions. I'll ask one and then I'll pass it on and ask another one and pass it on. Her first question, are towns where Irene hit hardest more open to climate resilience?
Yes, with a few exceptions probably, but most of them that worked pretty well as a hint. Yeah.
Okay. Jennifer, you want to ask your question? You want to unmute, Jenna?
While Jen's spooling up, I should.
Sorry,
Oh, there she is.
I couldn't find my name. I had to scroll across the top. Do you think post-storm repairs would have been done differently if there had been more hazard mitigation planning before Irene? I have a place up there, and I saw a lot of culvert repair and bank replacement that was sort of hastily done, or do just people react that way in emergency out of get it done fast attitude?
A couple of things. The urge to renormalize is huge after a disaster. It is like a psychological imperative. So people don't like things to be out of whack. A lot of people have heavy equipment in Vermont, and so they're just like going out and scooping around. And unfortunately, the governor basically kind of let the word be known, like, we're not going to mess with you if you're out scooping around, which really cranked a lot of the disaster people who deal with flooding, because we did a lot of damage. In fact, in some places we did more damage from the so-called repair than we did head from the flood. So to me, one of the things that a mitigation plan does is it has that conversation during what I call peacetime to remind everybody about, oh, when that thing goes out, don't put it back. We're going to need to think about how big it needs to be. If you take that plan to the next level, you've actually thought and done the hydraulics and go, oh, that bridge needs to be a 30-footer, not a 20-footer. Remember that when it goes out. And you can kind of just get a general mindset about, it's not about just rushing around and putting it back. It's about making it better. The hard part is FEMA is much easier to deal with if you just put it back. versus no, we're going to do something different. And you need to kind of get some approval on that. You got to wait, a month or whatever, and you have to deal with the fact that there's going to be a giant hole where you were supposed to put it back. So the thing that we try to tell towns is do what we call emergency temporary repairs, and we say, and you write that down on every piece of paper. That's an emergency temporary repair. Make it look like an emergency temporary repair. So literally, where we had 12-foot bridges, there were 2-foot culverts in the stream afterwards to make the water go. But it looked like, well, that's not going to stay there. And that's very important because FEMA will gladly go, oh, you threw the bridge back in, looks good to us, you're all done.
Okay. So, Shamika, you have a comment?
Yeah, so obviously we're on an online class, and some people you said joined from another class. So I just wanted to let folks know that the climate adaptation team that I work on in New York with others around the area, at the Nature Conservancy, we have, GIS specialists that have helped to create maps using those federal layers first, but also including the science that some of our scientists have done. We're looking at marsh migration. We're looking at how tidal wetlands are changing based on sea level rise, how groundwater is intruding into certain properties, how that's affecting the water quality, how that's affecting the things that are happening offshore. And a whole bunch of other things, honestly. And we've bitten off quite a lot. There's more than 40 of us working on this project just in New York. This also includes creating policy around this, how we stop certain communities from being gentrified once they've been, updated and upgraded. So I'm saying all of this because I didn't get to meet everyone, and I wanted for anyone who is interested in talking about this or who is an adaptation professional to reach out to me. I'm going to put my email in the chat for everyone. Yeah, that was it.
Okay, well, thank you. I want to go back to Julie. She had, as I said, she had a couple of questions. So are your hazard mitigation plan conversations increasingly related to climate preparedness or not yet?
Well, under the Obama administration, FEMA actually did a presidential directive that mitigation plans had to take into account climate change. I believe that went out the door under the Trump administration. But you could still do it, and it's still a bright idea, and climate change still actually exists, and it's gotten worse. So I would say most people think about that. Our state mitigation plan looks at it as kind of a meta disaster because it's not climate change that's the disaster. It's a increased threat of an ice storm or an increased threat of a flood or an increase. So it's your traditional hazards. They're just getting worse. But there are sometimes you may be having hazards that weren't really on your plate before. Being a wildfire person in the past, I'm always like, everything's going to burn down. And there is some increased wildfire risk where before in the Northeast we might have said, we don't have a wildfire risk. And things like that are actually should be coming on the play.
Okay. How do you deal with the quote likelihood part of the risk coefficient? If your community is not made up of scientists or there's not scientific wherewithal to understand probability and variability historically. Let's not even talk about the future.
Sure. To me, well, I talk about uncertainty in certain ways, and then I talk about probability in certain ways, because some people just, they're not into some people just can't do percents, right? They do percents, and then it ends up being some weird number. So I think of dice because people understand dice. You go, it's got 6 sides, and that means the chance of you rolling a 1 is a 1 out of 6 because only one of those sides is going to come up. So imagine a dice with 100 sides. and one of those sides says flood, that's the 1% chance flood. And so the more you can kind of make it into something like that that's relatable to them, the more that they may be understanding risk. When I talk about climate change, because there are a lot of people, of course, who don't buy into climate change, or they're not sure or whatever. And that's fine from their point of view. You got to meet them where they are. I talk about uncertainty. And so, I say, well, maybe I'm wrong about climate change, but maybe I'm a little bit right. Let's say I'm only 5% right. And you're, 95% right. But if these things that I think are going to happen are 5%, let's just pretend it's a school bus. And the bad thing has a 5% chance of happening to the school bus. Is your kid getting on the bus? And, every mom in the room is going to be like, nope, that's not happening at 5% level. If there's a 5% chance that there's a shark in the water, people don't go in the water because there's a shark. And you have like a, 0.0000000 way out percent chance of a shark attacking you. And even if it attacks you, and even if it's a great white, you're probably not going to die. So, bring home the things that actually they worry about and show them the percent risk of that, and then go and show them the percent risk of the thing that you're talking about. And so that way you may get apples to apples.
Okay. Natty, you got a question or two?
Yes. Hello again, Kevin. So speaking about, I guess, regional planning commissions in general, how are communities able to meet the ERAF requirements, or for those of you that the acronym Emergency Relief and Assistance Funds, which Kevin talked about earlier, which is the state provides a portion of that 25% not covered by FEMA money.
Right.
So are communities meeting those ERAF requirements to get that additional funding? What are the sticking points? And how are regional planning commissions filling the skill gaps that communities have in order to be able to either fulfill those requirements or meet additional needs?
Good. Well, and I'm going to genericize ERAF kind of around the country too. So ERAF is a state bonus on the percent that you're going to do. There's a lot of noise coming out about FEMA, that they are going to raise the cap for disasters, and that they may do something that they're calling kind of a disaster deductible, so that steps that towns have taken ahead of time to reduce disasters kind of get counted towards your disaster deductible. So there's a lot of good stuff around, it makes money sense to do some smart stuff. In Vermont, you need 4 things to get the state 12.5% match. You need to be in the National Flood Insurance Program, which is a good idea, even if you don't have flood risks. You need to have what we call a local emergency management plan, which is a very basic emergency plan, and nearly any town can do it in an afternoon. Every town probably has such a thing in the heads, at least, of their responder out there. You need to adopt the road and bridge standards, so you need to be building your roads up to the state promulgated standard out there. And then you need to have a local hazard mitigation plan. Those are the 4 puppies. To get above and beyond and to get even more matched, you need to do one of 2 things, and that is regulate what we call river corridors, which are these erosive areas next to rivers, or you can be a community rating system town. And I'd love to see, I think that that's probably where in bulk we could get more towns up to the higher level, is through community rating system, which is it's a FEMA program for flood insurance towns to do above and beyond. It's just a paperwork nightmare to get into the system right now. Somewhere on my desk or over here, I have the it's literally a binder about yay big. And you go, well, no town is, you just show them the binder. They're like, I'm not going to do that. But we have impervious brains to deal with paperwork. And so we can do a lot of that stuff. A lot of that stuff it's just about public education, about having maps available. We could, I think, do a lot of those things and help towns actually get in CRS.
Okay. Anything else, Natty?
Nope. For now, that's it. I'm sure there's more. There's more cooking though.
Okay. That's it, Kevin. It doesn't seem like there's any more questions coming down the pike.
Okay. Well, I'm sure you may think of them later. If you do, Michael knows how to get a hold of me, but if you just Google like Kevin Geiger, Vermont, you'll probably get me. My email is kgeiger@trorc.org. So if you also just go to trorc.org, you'll find me over there. I'm glad to talk to all sorts of people. I have sometimes folks from Michael's class call me up. I just had a guy from Dartmouth call me up today. Keep up the good work. There's going to be more of this stuff, man.
Okay. Thank you, Kevin. We really appreciate it. And thanks, everyone, for taking time out of your busy day to join us. So I'll see you at the next ULA meeting, Kevin.
You bet.
Okay. Thank
See
you.
you guys.
Thank you.
Gals, everybody.
Thank you.